begin.
A 6-year-old leukemia patient in Austin asked a Hells Angels road captain, "Can you make me feel brave?" The night before her life-or-death surgery, so he showed up with 127 bikers who roared into the hospital parking lot, and when the hospital tried to ban them for creating a disturbance, the internet exposed that they were the only ones who'd paid for her $480,000 transplant. Where are you watching this from right now? I need to see how far across America this story reaches. Drop your city in the comments below. I want every state represented. And if this is your first time here, smash that subscribe button. Now let's get into the story. Blaze Medrano wasn't supposed to be on the 4th floor of Dell Children's Medical Center. The Hells Angels, Austin chapter, had a standing agreement with the burn unit on the 2nd floor. Twice a month, they'd visit kids recovering from house fires and car wrecks, the kind of trauma that left visible scars. But the oncology wing? That was off limits, not because of hospital policy, because of Blaze's policy, because every bald head and every IV pole and every parent sleeping in a chair too small for their body reminded him of Lily, of the 2 years he'd watched his daughter disappear into a disease that didn't care how much he loved her, of the fact that 8 years later he still couldn't walk past a children's hospital without feeling like someone was standing on his chest. But today, volunteers were short-staffed, and the burn unit director had asked if Blaze could deliver some donated toys to oncology on his way out. Just drop them at the nurse's station. 5 minutes, in and out. No eye contact with patients, no conversations, no opening doors he'd spent 8 years keeping sealed shut. He was walking past room 412 when he heard it. Not loud crying, not the tantrum-throwing, attention-seeking kind, the quiet, defeated kind, the crying of someone who'd given up on anyone hearing. Blaze stopped, knew he shouldn't look, knew that whatever was behind that door would cost him something he wasn't sure he could afford to pay. But 47 years of life had taught him that the worst decisions were usually the ones where you kept walking. So he looked. The girl was tiny, 6, maybe 7 years old, bald from chemo, an IV pole beside her bed dripping something clear into her arm. She wore a hospital gown covered in cartoon puppies that were supposed to be cheerful, but just looked sad against the white institutional walls. And in her arms, she clutched a stuffed lion that looked like it had survived the same war she was fighting. One ear torn, fur matted, the kind of loved that only happens when something becomes your entire world. She was staring out the window at downtown Austin, at the buildings catching the late afternoon sun, and even from the doorway Blaze could see the resignation in her small shoulders, the look of someone who'd already decided how this story ended. He should have walked away. Should have delivered the toys and left and gone back to the clubhouse on Balm Road where he could drink enough Shiner Bock to forget he'd seen her. But Blaze had never been good at should, so he knocked on the door frame, gentle, the way you knock when you don't want to scare someone who's already terrified. "Hey there, you okay?" The girl turned and Blaze felt time stop, because she had Lily's eyes. Not the same color. Lily's had been green like her mother's. This girl's were brown like Texas earth. But the same weight, the same exhaustion, the same look of a child forced to understand mortality before she'd learned algebra. She studied him for a long moment, taking in the leather vest with its patches and its history, the tattoos covering both arms like armor made of ink, the scar across his eyebrow from a fight in an Amarillo bar he barely remembered. Her eyes went wide, not scared wide, curious wide. "Are you a Hell's Angel?" Her voice was small but steady, like she'd practiced being brave so many times it had become muscle memory. Blaze glanced down at his vest, at the patches that told 30 years of stories he'd never fully explained to civilians. "Yeah, sweetheart, I am." She nodded like this made perfect sense. Like tattooed bikers visiting children's hospitals was just another Tuesday in Austin, Texas. Then she asked the question that would detonate every wall Blaze had spent 8 years building. "Can you make me feel brave?" The hospital sounds faded into white noise. The fluorescent light seemed to dim, and Blaze stood frozen in that doorway, seeing two paths. The safe one where he said something comforting and walked away, and the honest one where he asked what she meant and risked shattering all over again. He chose honest. Always had. Always would. "What do you need to be brave for, darling?" Ophelia's eyes filled with tears that she tried to blink away, tried to be strong, tried to do what she thought brave people did. "Tomorrow morning they're putting someone else's bone marrow inside me. The doctor said it might work, but she also said it might not. Said my body might reject it, and then I'll get really sick and—" Her voice cracked, broke. "And then I'll die. And I'm so scared. But I don't want to die being scared. I want to die being brave." She held up the stuffed lion, its torn ear flopping. "Like Aslan. Like a warrior." Blaze felt something crack inside his chest. Not a hairline fracture. A full structural collapse. Because he'd heard almost these exact words 8 years ago from a 7-year-old girl with green eyes who'd asked him if dying hurt and if he'd be proud of her for being brave. And he'd lied to Lily, told her brave people weren't scared, told her she just had to be strong. And she died terrified, trying to live up to an impossible standard because her father didn't know how to tell her the truth. He wasn't making that mistake twice. Blaze walked into room 412, his boots heavy on the linoleum, and crouched beside Ophelia's bed, the way he used to crouch beside Lily's. Eye level. No talking down. Just two people having the most important conversation of their lives. "What's your name?" "Ophelia. But my grandma calls me Leah." "Leah, I'm Blaze. And I need to tell you something, okay? Something important." He reached out slowly, let her decide if she wanted to take his hand. She did, her small fingers wrapping around his scarred knuckles. Brave people get scared all the time. That's what makes them brave. It's not about not being afraid. It's about being so terrified you can barely breathe and showing up anyway. Her eyes searched his face, looking for lies, looking for the same empty comfort every adult had probably given her. "Really? Really? You know what warriors do before battle?" She shook her head. "They get scared. They throw up. They cry. They want to run. But they show up anyway. Because courage isn't a feeling, Leah. It's a choice. And you've already made it. You're already braver than most grown men I know." Ophelia was quiet for a moment, processing, and then she asked the question that would change everything. "Will you be there tomorrow, when I have to be brave?" Blaze had spent 8 years running from that question. 8 years building walls between himself and any child who might remind him of what he'd lost. 8 years telling himself that the pain of loving and losing was worse than the emptiness of never loving at all. But standing in room 412 of Dell Children's Medical Center, looking at a 6-year-old girl who was asking him to witness her courage, he realized something that made his throat close up. He'd been wrong. The emptiness was worse. The walls were worse. The running was worse. Because Lily hadn't died so he could spend the rest of his life afraid to care. She'd died hoping he'd keep being the father who showed up, even if it wasn't for her anymore. "Yeah, Leah," Blaze heard himself say. "I'll be there. I promise." Ophelia's face transformed. The fear didn't disappear. Fear doesn't work that way. But hope crept in beside it, making room, giving her something to hold on to besides her stuffed lion. Really? You promise? Because a lot of grown-ups say they'll come back and then they don't. Blaze felt that like a knife between the ribs. Who told you they'd come back? Ophelia looked down at Aslan, her fingers tracing the torn ear. My daddy, when I was 4. He said he was just going to the store and he'd bring me ice cream. But the police came instead and told my grandma he robbed a man with a gun, and now he's in Huntsville for 8 more years. And my mama... Her voice got smaller. My mama said she loved me more than anything. But then she took too many pills and went to sleep and didn't wake up. That was 2 years ago. Jesus Christ. This kid had watched everyone she loved either die or abandon her. And she was still asking strangers to show up, still believing that maybe this time someone would keep their promise. That wasn't just brave. That was the kind of courage that made war heroes look like amateurs. Leah, I'm going to tell you something about Hell's Angels, Blaze said, his voice rough with emotion he wasn't trying to hide anymore. We don't make promises we can't keep. When I say I'll be there tomorrow, I mean I'll be there. Me and probably a few of my brothers. Would that be okay if I brought some friends? Her eyes went wide. Other bikers? Like a whole group? Something like that. Ophelia clutched Aslan tighter, and for the first time since Blaze had walked into that room, she smiled. Small, uncertain, but real. That would be really cool. Because then if I get scared, I can remember that warriors showed up for me, that I'm not alone. Blaze stood, his knees protesting, and placed one scarred hand on her small shoulder. You're not alone, Leah. Not anymore. Now get some rest. You've got a battle to fight tomorrow, and warriors need sleep before they go to war. He walked out of room 412 and made it exactly 15 feet down the hallway before he had to stop and lean against the wall, his chest heaving, his vision blurring, because he'd just promised a dying child he'd be there. Promised her the one thing he'd sworn he'd never do again after Lily: get attached, get involved, let himself care enough that losing her would break him. But maybe that was the point. Maybe you didn't honor the dead by protecting yourself from the living. Maybe you honored them by showing up for every kid who needed someone to prove that not all adults were liars. Blaze pulled out his phone and sent a text to the Brotherhood group chat, the one that connected all 73 members of the Hell's Angels Austin chapter. Emergency church tonight, 8 p.m. Don't miss it. This one matters. The Hell's Angels. Austin Clubhouse sat on Balm Road like a fortress that had seen better days and worse fights. Cinder block walls, steel-reinforced doors, security cameras that actually worked. Inside, the main room smelled like motor oil, leather, and 30 years of brotherhood that couldn't be washed out of the walls. By 7:45 p.m., 68 angels had shown up. Not bad for 90 minutes' notice. Blaze stood at the front of the room, behind the scarred wooden table where the officers sat, and waited for the conversations to die down. Toro Alvarado, chapter president, former Marine, the kind of man who could end a bar fight with a look, rapped his knuckles on the table. Church is in session. Blaze called this meeting. Floor is yours, brother. Blaze took a breath. He'd led men in combat in Kandahar. He'd negotiated territory disputes with rival clubs in Houston. But asking his brothers to ride into a children's hospital to support a dying kid he'd met 3 hours ago? That required a different kind of courage. There's a 6-year-old girl on the 4th floor of Dell Children's. Name's Ophelia, stage 4 leukemia. Tomorrow morning, she's getting a bone marrow transplant that might save her life or might kill her. Her father's in Huntsville. Her mother OD'd 2 years ago. Her grandmother had a stroke last week and is in a different hospital. She's got nobody. The room stayed silent, but Blaze could see it working on them. These weren't Boy Scouts. These were men who'd done time, who'd buried brothers, who understood that the world was cruel and the only thing that made it bearable was showing up for each other. She asked me if I could make her feel brave, asked if I'd be there tomorrow when she walks to surgery, and I said yes. But here's the thing. I want to do more than just show up. I want to show her what an army looks like. I want her to walk to that surgical wing through a corridor of warriors so she knows she's not alone. So she knows that courage isn't something you're born with. It's something you're given by the people who show up. Viper Rodriguez, Sergeant-at-Arms, covered in scars from knife fights and bad decisions, raised his hand. You're asking us to ride to a children's hospital at dawn and line up like an honor guard for a kid we've never met? Blaze nodded. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm asking. Viper grinned, showing the gap where he'd lost a tooth in Waco. I'm in. What time? The room erupted. Brothers volunteering, asking logistics, debating routes. And Wrench Patterson, 74 years old, riding since 1971, the club's living history, stood up slowly, his voice cutting through the noise like a chainsaw through pine. I lost my granddaughter to cancer 3 years ago. She was 8. And the day before she died, she told me she was scared nobody would remember her, that she'd just disappear like she never mattered. His voice cracked. We couldn't save her. But maybe we can show this little girl that she matters, that she'll be remembered, that warriors don't forget their own. The vote was unanimous, not just Austin. Toro started making calls to San Antonio, to Houston, to Dallas. By 10 p.m., 127 Hells Angels from across Texas had committed to ride. They'd leave their cities at 4 a.m., converge on Austin by 6 a.m., and be in position at Dell Children's by 6:30. Blaze stood there watching his brothers organize the logistics, coordinate with hospital security, plan the formation, and felt something he hadn't felt in 8 years. Purpose. Not the hollow kind that came from staying busy to avoid thinking. The real kind that came from doing something that mattered. Toro clapped him on the shoulder. You good, brother? Blaze looked at his president, at the man who'd pulled him off a bar stool in San Marcos 10 years ago and offered him a vest and a family when he had neither. I'm terrified. That kid looks exactly like Lily. If she doesn't make it, then we'll carry you through it, Toro said simply. Same way you've carried us. That's what brothers do. Blaze returned to Dell Children's at 7 p.m. after church ended, after he'd gone home to shower and change into clean jeans and his vest, and tried to figure out how to explain to a 6-year-old that tomorrow morning over 100 bikers were going to show up for her. The fourth-floor nurses' station looked at him suspiciously when he walked past. Hospital staff never quite knew what to do with Hell's Angels, even when they were volunteering, but one nurse, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a name tag that said Sarah Vega, smiled and pointed toward room 412. She's been asking about you. Wanted to make sure you were real and not something she imagined. Blaze's throat tightened. I'm real. Is it okay if I sit with her for a bit? Sarah's smile widened. Honey, you're the first person who's made that little girl smile in 3 days. You can sit with her as long as you want. Ophelia was awake, sitting up in bed, Aslan in her lap and a coloring book open in front of her. She was coloring a picture of a lion, clearly Aslan, and when she saw Blaze, her whole face lit up like sunrise over the Texas hill country. You came back. I told the nurse you would, but I wasn't sure and I thought maybe... She stopped, took a breath, trying to control the hope that clearly terrified her more than the surgery. Blaze pulled up a chair beside her bed, the same chair where her grandmother probably sat before the stroke, where her absent father should have been sitting for 6 years. "I told you, Leah. Hell's angels keep their promises. And I've got something to tell you about tomorrow." She set down her crayon, gave him her full attention. "Tomorrow morning, you're walking to surgery at 7:30, right?" She nodded. "The doctor said they have to start early because it takes a long time." "Okay, so here's what's going to happen. I'm going to be here at 6:30, and I'm bringing some friends, a lot of friends, and we're going to line up from your room all the way to the surgical wing so that when you walk through warriors, through people who came just for you. Because you're not doing this alone, Leah. You're doing it with an army." Ophelia stared at him, her brown eyes filling with tears. She tried to blink away. "How many friends?" Blaze smiled. "About 127. Her jaw dropped. Actually dropped. 127 bikers coming here? For me? For you? Because that's what warriors do. We show up for each other." She was quiet for a long moment, processing something too big for a 6-year-old brain to fully comprehend. Then she asked the question that gutted him. "Why? You don't even know me. Why would you do this?" And Blaze had a choice. He could give her the easy answer, the one that didn't hurt, or he could give her the truth. He chose truth. "Because 8 years ago I had a daughter. Her name was Lily. She was 7 when she died of cancer, and the day before she died, she asked me if I was proud of her for being brave, and I told her yes. But I should have told her something else. I should have told her that I was proud of her for being scared and showing up anyway, for fighting even when she wanted to give up, for asking for help when she needed it. That's real courage, Leah, and you have it, and I can't save Lily. But maybe I can make sure you know you're not alone, that someone sees how brave you are, that you matter." Ophelia reached out and took his hand, her small fingers wrapping around his scarred knuckles, and said 7 words that broke him completely. "I think Lily would be really proud." At 6 a.m., downtown Austin was just starting to wake up. Early commuters heading to offices on Congress Avenue, nurses changing shifts at the hospitals that dotted the medical district. The sky was that perfect Texas blue that promised heat later, but right now was cool enough to remind you why people moved here in the first place. And then the sound started, low at first, distant thunder rolling in from every direction, from I-35 North, from Highway 183, from Mopac Expressway, from Ben White Boulevard. The sound of 127 Harley-Davidson engines converging on Dell Children's Medical Center like a precision military operation, which is exactly what it was. The first wave came from San Antonio, 23 bikes, led by a road captain named Diablo who'd served in the Marines with Blaze in Afghanistan. The second wave from Houston, 31 bikes, including 3 women riders who'd lost children to cancer and understood exactly what this meant. The third wave from Dallas, 19 bikes, some of them grandfathers who'd driven through the night because nobody should face surgery alone. And the Austin contingent, 54 bikes, Blaze at the front, Toro beside him, the entire chapter rolling as one. They converged on East 32nd Street at 6:15 a.m., and the sound of 127 Harleys idling in formation was enough to shake windows 4 floors up. Hospital security panicked, called the front desk, called Austin PD. But Toro had already coordinated with both, had the permits, had the liaison officer's number, had done everything by the book so nobody could say they were breaking laws or threatening anyone. They were just a group of citizens exercising their First Amendment right to assemble and support a child. The formation was military precise. 2 columns starting at the main entrance, running through the lobby, up the stairs to the fourth floor, lining the hallway from room 412 all the way to the surgical wing entrance. 90 feet of leather and chrome, and men who'd seen combat and heartbreak and had decided that protecting one little girl was worth more than protecting their reputation. Nurses stared, doctors whispered, and Director Patricia Hammond, the hospital administrator who ran Dell Children's like a Fortune 500 company instead of a place where children fought for their lives, came storming out of her office looking like she was about to declare war. She was 58, silver hair pulled into a tight bun, wearing a pantsuit that probably cost more than most of the bikes in the parking lot. And she had the kind of authority that came from years of making decisions based on liability and optics instead of compassion. What is the meaning of this? Her voice could have cut glass. Who authorized 127 motorcycles to park on hospital property? Toro stepped forward, calm, respectful, every inch the Marine officer he used to be. Ma'am, I'm Toro Alvarado, president of the Hells Angels Austin chapter. We coordinated with your security team, with Austin PD, and with Nurse Sarah Vega on the fourth floor. We're here to support a patient. We're not breaking any laws. We're not blocking emergency access. We're just here to show a little girl she's not alone. Hammond's face turned red. This is a children's hospital. You're terrifying patients and families. I want you off this property in 10 minutes or I'm calling the police. Blaze stepped up beside Toro, his voice quiet but carrying. Ma'am, the little girl we're here for is named Ophelia. She's 6 years old. She's having a bone marrow transplant this morning that might kill her. And she asked me yesterday if I could make her feel brave. So, yeah, we're here. And we're staying until she walks to surgery. After that, we'll leave quietly. But we're not leaving before. Hammond opened her mouth to argue, and that's when Sarah Vega appeared at the top of the stairs, her voice cutting through the tension. Director Hammond? Ophelia is awake. She's asking for Blaze, and she can hear the motorcycles. She's smiling. Hammond turned, looked at the nurse, then at the 127 bikers standing in perfect formation, and made a calculation that had nothing to do with compassion and everything to do with PR. If she kicked them out now, it would look cruel. If she let them stay, she could control the narrative. Fine. But after the surgery, you're gone. And if I hear one complaint from a parent, one report of intimidation, you're banned from this property permanently. Blaze nodded. Yes, ma'am. Hammond walked away, already pulling out her phone to call legal, and Blaze looked at Toro. She's going to be a problem. Toro grinned. She's already a problem. But we're not here for her. We're here for Ophelia. Room 412 was quiet when Blaze walked in at 6:45 a.m., the dawn light streaming through the window and turning everything gold. Ophelia was sitting up in bed, dressed in a hospital gown and a red jacket that Sarah Vega had found in the pediatric lost and found, because Blaze had asked if there was anything warrior-colored the girl could wear. She looked tiny, fragile, but her eyes were bright with something that hadn't been there yesterday. Hope mixed with terror, courage built on a foundation of fear. Is that them? Her voice was barely a whisper. All those motorcycles? They're really here? Blaze crouched beside her bed, eye level, the way he'd done 1,000 times with Lily. Every single one. 127 warriors from Austin, San Antonio, Houston, and Dallas. They rode through the night to be here for you. And they're forming a corridor from your room to the surgical wing so that when you walk through family. Tears streamed down her face. I've never had this many people show up for me. Even when my mama was alive, even at my birthday parties, nobody came because kids at school said I was weird because I was always sick. But now, she couldn't finish. Just cried into Aslan's torn ear while Blaze held her hand and felt his own eyes burn. Sarah Vega appeared in the doorway with a wheelchair. "Sweetie, we need to get you downstairs for pre-op. You ready?" Ophelia looked at Blaze, terrified. "Will you walk with me?" "Every step, Leah. I promise." They took the elevator down to the first floor, and when the doors opened, Ophelia saw them. Saw the first two bikers standing at attention on either side of the lobby entrance. Saw their leather vests with patches that told stories of service and sacrifice. Saw their faces, some young, some old, all of them watching her with respect usually reserved for soldiers heading to war. And she understood. She mattered. Not because she was dying, not because she was sick, but because she was fighting. Because she'd had the courage to ask for help. Because she was a warrior. Blaze pushed her wheelchair slowly, giving her time to see each face, each vest, each man and woman who'd shown up because one little girl needed to know she wasn't disposable. Parents in the lobby stopped and stared. Some filmed on their phones. Some cried. And one mother, holding her own sick child, mouthed "thank you" to Blaze as they passed. The corridor to the surgical wing stretched 90 feet. On both sides, Hell's Angels stood at attention, and as Ophelia passed, each biker placed their right hand over their heart in respect. No words, just acknowledgement. Warrior to warrior. By the time they reached the surgical wing doors, Ophelia was sobbing too hard to speak. But she turned in her wheelchair, looked back at the 127 bikers who'd shown up for her, and raised her small fist in salute. The roar of approval shook the building. Grown men who'd survived Fallujah and Kandahar and bar fights that should have killed them were openly weeping. And Blaze crouched, one last time, looked Ophelia in the eyes and said, "You're the bravest person I've ever met. Lily would have loved you. Now go show that cancer what Texas warriors are made of." She hugged him, her small arms barely reaching around his neck, and whispered, "If I die, will you remember me?" Blaze's voice broke. "Leah, after today, America's gonna remember you." The surgical doors closed, taking her away, and Blaze stood there in that hallway surrounded by his brothers, shaking so hard Toro had to steady him, because he'd just sent another little girl into surgery, and he couldn't survive losing two. The surgery took 6 hours, 6 hours of Blaze pacing the surgical waiting room on the 4th floor while his brothers rotated shifts outside, maintaining the formation, refusing to leave until they knew Ophelia was safe. 6 hours of Nurse Sarah Vega bringing him coffee he didn't drink and updates he couldn't process. 6 hours of Blaze reliving every moment of Lily's final surgery, the one where he'd gotten the call in Kandahar that she'd coded on the table and they'd revived her, but the cancer had won anyway. He couldn't do this again. Couldn't watch another little girl fight a battle that medicine should have figured out by now. Couldn't. The waiting room door opened, and Director Patricia Hammond walked in with 2 people in suits, lawyers, hospital lawyers. Blaze's stomach dropped. "Mr. Medrano, we need to talk." Toro stood up from where he'd been sitting, protective. "About what?" Hammond's face was stone. "About the spectacle this morning. About the disruption to our facility. About the complaints we've received from parents who felt intimidated by 127 bikers lining our halls." Blaze's voice came out cold. "Intimidated?" "We stood quietly. We didn't speak to anyone. We were respectful. We followed every rule you gave us." One of the lawyers, a man in his 40s with slicked back hair and dead eyes, stepped forward. "Mr. Medrano, Dell Children's Medical Center has a responsibility to provide a safe, calm environment for all patients and families. Your presence, however well-intentioned, created anxiety. We're issuing a formal trespass warning. You and your associates are banned from this property effective immediately." The room went silent. Every angel in the waiting room, there were 12 now, the others rotating outside, turned to stare at the lawyers with the kind of look that usually preceded violence. But Blaze held up a hand. "We're banned? For supporting a dying kid? For making her feel like she mattered?" Hammond's voice was clipped, professional. "You're banned for creating a disturbance. Now please leave before we call security." And that's when Sarah Vega walked in, her face flushed, her voice shaking with rage that had been building for what looked like years. "You want to ban them? These men? The only people who showed up for a little girl who's been abandoned by everyone, including this hospital?" Hammond turned, her authority threatened. "Nurse Vega, this doesn't concern you." "Like hell it doesn't." Sarah's voice was loud enough that people in the hallway stopped to listen. "You want to know why Ophelia's surgery almost didn't happen? Because she's uninsured? Because her grandmother declared bankruptcy paying for treatments? Because this hospital demanded payment guarantees before scheduling a bone marrow transplant for a 6-year-old child, and you sat in your office calculating liability while that little girl wondered if she was going to die because she was poor?" The color drained from Hammond's face. "That's not... We have protocols." "Your protocols almost killed her," Sarah interrupted. "And the only reason she's in surgery right now is because these dangerous bikers started a GoFundMe at 6 this morning to cover costs you refused to waive. So go ahead, ban them. But I'm calling every news station in Texas to explain exactly why you did it." The waiting room door opened again, and this time it was a reporter from KVUE News with a camera operator. Someone had already called the media. Hammond looked at the camera, at the bikers, at Sarah, and Blaze saw the exact moment she realized she'd walked into a PR nightmare with no exit strategy. The story broke at 11:47 a.m. while Ophelia was still in surgery. Hospital director threatens to ban Hell's Angels who supported dying cancer patient. Trended on Twitter within 20 minutes. The video of Hammond threatening the ban, filmed by a parent in the waiting room, went viral. 6 million views in 2 hours. News crews descended on Dell Children's. Reporters ambushed Hammond in the parking lot. And the internet did what it does best. It dug. They found that Ophelia's grandmother, Rosita Delgado, had declared bankruptcy in March after $180,000 in medical bills. They found that Dell Children's had a policy of requiring payment guarantees for expensive procedures for uninsured patients. They found that the hospital had delayed scheduling Ophelia's transplant for 3 weeks while verifying funding sources. 3 weeks during which her cancer progressed. And they found the GoFundMe. The one Blaze had started at 6 a.m. that morning with a simple message. "This is Ophelia. She's 6. She's fighting leukemia. Her transplant costs $480,000. Her family has nothing. But she's not alone. The Hell's Angels are her family now. Help us save her." By noon, the GoFundMe had raised $180,000. By 2 p.m., when Ophelia came out of surgery alive and the transplant showing early signs of taking, it had hit $340,000. And by 5 p.m., when Blaze walked into Director Hammond's office with a cashier's check and every news camera in Austin filming, it had surpassed $425,000. Blaze laid the check on her desk. $340,000, made out to Dell Children's Medical Center. "You wanted payment guarantees? Here's your payment. This is what happens when the system fails and family shows up. Now save that little girl's life, or explain to America why you're refusing money that came from people who actually give a damn." Hammond stared at the check, at the cameras, at the crowd of reporters in her hallway, and knew she'd lost. Not just this battle. The war. because America had chosen sides, and they'd chosen the bikers over the bureaucrat. "Mr. Medrano," her voice was quiet now, defeated. "The trespass warning is rescinded. You're welcome here. And I apologize for—" "Don't apologize to me," Blaze interrupted. "Apologize to Ophelia. Apologize for making a 6-year-old child wonder if she was going to die because her family couldn't pay. Apologize for treating health care like a privilege instead of a right, and then fix your system so the next kid doesn't need bikers to save them." He walked out without waiting for a response, and the news cameras followed him to the 4th floor, where 127 Hells Angels were still standing watch outside the surgical recovery wing, refusing to leave until they knew Ophelia was stable. Dr. Jennifer Ochoa, the pediatric oncologist who'd performed the transplant, came out at 6:30 p.m., exhausted but smiling. "She made it. The transplant took. She's in recovery. She's asking for Blaze." Blaze felt his knees buckle. Toro caught him, held him up, and whispered, "She made it, brother. She made it." They led him into recovery at 7 p.m. Ophelia was pale, weak, hooked to more machines than Blaze could count. But her eyes were open, and when she saw him, she smiled. "Did the warriors stay?" Her voice was barely there, wrecked from the breathing tube. Blaze took her hand, careful of the IVs. "Every single one. They're outside right now waiting to make sure you're okay." She squeezed his hand with strength that shouldn't have been possible for someone who'd just had bone marrow injected into their body. "I was brave. I was so scared I threw up twice. But I did it. I showed up." Blaze's vision blurred. "You showed up like a warrior, Leah. Lily would be so proud. I'm so proud." Ophelia's eyes started to close, exhaustion winning. But before she fell asleep, she whispered, "Can you be my family? Not just for one day. Forever." 3 months later, Austin's August heat was brutal enough to make you question every life choice that had led you to Texas. But nobody in the crowd gathering at Zilker Park seemed to mind. The Hells Angels. Austin chapter was hosting their annual Freedom Rally, a day of bikes, barbecue, live music, and fundraising for veteran causes. Except this year, they'd added something new. The Lily and Ophelia Foundation booth sat front and center, covered in photos of 2 little girls. One with green eyes who'd died 8 years ago, and one with brown eyes who'd survived because 127 strangers refused to let her die alone. Ophelia stood beside the booth wearing a custom Hells Angels kids vest that said "Honorary Warrior" on the back, her hair growing back in soft brown fuzz. Holding Aslan, who'd been professionally repaired but still showed his battle scars. She was healthy, thriving. The transplant had taken completely. Dr. Ochoa called it a miracle. But Blaze knew better. It was courage. Pure, distilled, warrior-grade courage. Rosita Delgado, Ophelia's grandmother, recovered from her stroke and walking with a cane, stood beside her granddaughter with tears in her eyes as Blaze explained to the crowd what the foundation would do: cover medical costs for uninsured pediatric cancer patients across Texas. No kid would face what Ophelia faced. No family would have to choose between bankruptcy and their child's life. The GoFundMe had ended at $890,000. After paying Ophelia's bills and covering Rosita's stroke treatment, there was $470,000 left, enough to help dozens of families. Enough to prove that when the system failed, Americans still knew how to take care of each other. Toro handed Blaze the microphone, and the crowd of 2,000 bikers, families, cancer survivors, people who'd seen the viral video and wanted to be part of something good, went quiet. 8 years ago, I lost my daughter Lily to cancer. I thought the pain would kill me. I thought I'd never be anyone's father again. I was wrong. He looked down at Ophelia, who was grinning up at him with the kind of love that made all the pain worth it. 3 months ago, a little girl asked me if I could make her feel brave. And I realized something. Bravery isn't something you give someone. It's something you witness. Ophelia was already brave. She just needed people to show up and see it, to prove she wasn't alone. That's what this foundation does. It shows up. It sees courage. And it refuses to let kids fight alone. The crowd erupted. The Hells Angels revved their engines in salute. And Ophelia, 6 years old, cancer survivor, warrior, raised her fist and shouted, "I'm brave!" Blaze had spent 8 years thinking he was honoring Lily by staying away from kids who needed him, by protecting himself from pain, by building walls. But standing there in Zilker Park, with Ophelia beside him and 127 brothers at his back, and a foundation named after 2 little girls who'd taught him what courage really meant, he finally understood. You didn't honor the dead by running from the living. You honored them by showing up, by loving the next kid who needed you, by proving that family wasn't about blood or biology or legal documents. Family was about who stayed when everyone else left, who showed up when you were too scared to stand, who loved you not despite your scars but because of them. Ophelia tugged his hand. "Blaze, can we go for a ride in the sidecar?" Blaze looked at Rosita, who nodded permission. Then he looked at his brothers, who'd already prepared his Harley with the custom sidecar they'd built for Ophelia, complete with seat belts, padding, and a holder for Aslan. "Let's ride, warrior." They mounted up, Ophelia in the sidecar clutching her lion, Blaze behind the handlebars of the bike that had carried him through grief and back to purpose. And as they rolled through Zilker Park with 127 Hells Angels in formation behind them, Ophelia raised both fists in triumph and screamed into the Texas wind, "I'm not scared anymore!" Blaze smiled, tears streaming into his beard, and thought about Lily, about the daughter he'd lost and the daughter he'd found, about how courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was the choice to show up anyway, and about how sometimes the men the world called dangerous were the only ones brave enough to care. The only ones who understood that saving one child's life was worth risking everything. The only ones who knew that brotherhood meant showing up at dawn with 127 bikes to prove that warriors don't abandon their own. Ever. If you believe that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's being terrified and showing up anyway, and that the people society calls dangerous are sometimes the only ones brave enough to prove that abandoned children still matter in America. Like and share this story. Subscribe now for more stories where brotherhood defeats bureaucracy. Also check out the 2 videos showing on the screen right now, specially crafted for you.